Boom. All right. Hi, everybody. What a week. My daughters started speaking in longer sentences. My wife and I had our first only us date since like the end of February, yesterday, or actually 2 days ago now. No, 3 days ago. And that's pretty much it. That's pretty much all that's happened, except for one specific thing. A study came out that explored the possible efficacy of psilocybin for the treatment of major depressive disorder, what we call depression. So, this was a study that was published in JAMA, which is a peer-reviewed journal of the American Medical Association, one of the most important medical journals in the world. And it was a study by folks at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, as well as Ohio State University, both of which are some of the top biomedical institutions in the world. And so I think it's worth going through a very quick, I really mean quick, review of psilocybin, just so that everybody's on the same, or at least a similar page. So first, psilocybin is a molecule that's naturally produced in hundreds of different fungi, but most closely associated with a genus of fungi called psilocybe. And so if you ever heard of the term magic mushrooms, those are the types of mushrooms that we're talking about here. So over there, you can see one of the fungi that produces psilocybin. This is Psilocybe cubensis. But there's a ton that produce the same compound. And just to be a little bit more accurate, I ought to say compounds. Psilocybin itself is actually what's called a prodrug. And the term prodrug basically means a substance that's converted into another substance once it's consumed. So once psilocybin is consumed, our body converts it into psilocin. Which you can see is very, in terms of the molecules, very similar to psilocybin. It's basically just like a phosphate group that P surrounded by several O's is converted into a hydroxyl group, which is just that OH. And so, to be clear, that's like essentially meaningless to people interested in potentially using these compounds for depression or really anything else. Your body takes care of that conversion for you, but if you take organic chemistry, it's something that it's something over which you'd probably agonize. And at least, I know when I was like overly interested in these little details when I was younger, that's the kind of thing that I would want to pay attention to. So anyways, this study was a randomized, waiting list controlled clinical trial, and it was conducted at Johns Hopkins. And they had a pretty wide variety of age groups represented, which is kind of cool. So adults from 21 to 75 years old who were diagnosed with major depressive disorder. So what is a waiting list controlled study? To be clear, that's specifically the control group. So it's a group of people who ultimately do receive the treatment, right? But it's just delayed relative to the treatment group or the test group. So in other words, everyone received the treatment in this study, which in this case was psilocybin, but they did the comparison between people who received psilocybin early and people who received it later who were on the waiting list. All right, so first of all, who was included in this study? So again, it was people who had moderate or severe major depressive disorder, or episodes of major depressive disorder, all of which were assessed according to the same scales that are used to measure the severity of the condition. And importantly, participants were not being treated with any pharmacotherapy for the depression when they were screened for participation in this study. So, none of them were using antidepressants, at least 5 half-lives before the screening and up to 4 months after enrollment, which is basically like up until the conclusion of like the main assessment of the study. And, to be clear, like decisions to either taper off or to continue to forego treatment with antidepressants were made by both the prospective participants along with the prescribing physicians. So, the biomedical scientists played no role in those decisions, just to be clear. And so participants also had to be medically stable. They had to not have any uncontrolled cardiovascular conditions, nor any personal or family history of psychotic or bipolar disorders. And on top of that, female participants couldn't be pregnant, they couldn't be breastfeeding, and weren't intending to become pregnant during the course of the study. Also, individuals with moderate or severe alcohol or other drug use, including nicotine, in the past year were excluded. And then finally, people who had either used hallucinogens, including psilocybin, either over 10 times or within the past 6 months couldn't participate. Okay. And so how did they get these participants? So they recruited with flyers, print advertisements, internet, social media, and the website for the study itself. And so 870 people were screened via phone or some kind of electronic screening. And then of them, 70 ended up undergoing in-person screening. And then ultimately 27 ended up enrolled in the study, allocated to either like the immediate treatment group or the waitlist group, the delayed treatment. Okay, and so the waitlist group received the psilocybin treatment 8 weeks after the immediate treatment group received it, right? So not like an incredibly long duration, but long enough for them to perform their comparison of like the efficacy between the two groups. All right, so what did the immediate treatment group look like? So altogether it was 8 weeks, and participants made a minimum of 18 in-person visits with 2 day-long psilocybin administration sessions, both of which were about 5 hours long. And all of this included, preparation meetings with all of those meetings amounted to about 8 hours total. And there were 2 session facilitators, which were researchers who would be around during the administration. And those facilitators participated in those meetings before the first psilocybin session, right? So everybody was very, very prepared for this. And then after that, the participants had follow-up meetings with after the psilocybin administrations. And so the people who acted as facilitators, they were staffers of the study with a variety of educational levels. So it wasn't just like one, type of training or something like that. People had like bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, PhDs, and MDs. And then also members of, disciplines from like social work to psychiatry. Okay. So after all the preparation, there were those 2 psilocybin sessions that occurred around 1.6 weeks apart. And that was an average, so some received it like a little bit more close together than others. And so they identified the dose of psilocybin for the first session as moderately high, at 20 milligrams per 70 kilograms for the first session, and then high for the second session, which was 30 milligrams per 70 kilograms. So to give you a sense of like what that means, like in pounds, if you're American, so 70 kilograms is about 154 pounds. So someone who's 154 pounds would have gotten 20 milligrams on the first treatment and then 30 milligrams on the second. And to be clear, these are not sub-threshold doses, right? So these folks were experiencing like psychedelic hallucinations. Okay, so I imagine that some people would be interested in how the psilocybin would be administered, right? Did they eat those mushrooms, or how do they take it? So they were given opaque gelatin capsules with about 100 milliliters of water. And that's not a ton of water, but it's not a little. So I'll just give you a little sense, a little demonstration. This is a graduated cylinder filled with 100 milliliters of water, and then here's a cup. A mug, a clear mug, so you can see. Oh, here we go. So it's like maybe like a fourth of a mug of water. All right. So it's not a ton, but it is enough. And so they had both of the facilitators, again in the room, available to respond if any of the participants had any needs during those like day-long sessions. And the study participants were told to lie on a couch, and the setting was, as they described it, living room-like. And so they didn't include any of the pictures of the environment, but I sort of doubt it was much like my personal chaotic living room that has like crayons and construction paper all over the place and like toys I didn't even know that we had all over the place. But I bet it was more like the living rooms of the people who are actually like civilized, like probably many of you. And so during the sessions, participants were encouraged by the facilitators to focus inward, paying attention to any experiences that arose. And that probably sounds kind of like strange and nebulous to people who've like never experienced substances like these, or maybe explored like mindfulness meditation. But the point is that they were the people around the participants were directing their attention inward rather than like focusing on anything that they might be experiencing around them, like the sensory distortions and those kinds of things. And so evidently they also played music. And here, let me clear these out. And they also wore eye shades and headphones, which I imagine is like pretty different relative to like the standard experience that most people have who've been exposed to these substances. And so eyes closed, ears occupied by specific soundtracks. And they actually provide the soundtrack in their supplemental figures, which is kind of cool. You can see just some of it here. They have like a song for like basically the entire time. And you can see, there's a fair amount of classical music, and there's some of what looks like ambient stuff. Like, I had intended to kind of go through it and like see what I thought about it, but they also had like some lovely guitar-based stuff. I did check some of them out, and just sort of like an eclectic mixture of fairly calm music, not exclusively calm though. Like, some of the classical music is like pretty intense. And so, I'll definitely be exploring some of these songs when I'm working next time, just because why not? But, some of them are kind of surprising, these songs, to be totally honest. But, I didn't take part in this study as a participant, nor as a researcher. So, maybe some of those epic songs that they included might, have had like a beneficial effect. All right, so what happened? The group compares their outcomes to those of ketamine, right? So ketamine is a medication that's pretty significantly different in many ways relative to psilocybin, but it's a reasonable comparison because it's also been a substance that's fairly recently been evaluated for possible efficacy in treating depression. And so, gosh, it's kind of dark. It's kind of tough to, let's see if I can fix that. It's kind of tricky when like you actually have backlighting and everything. Let's crank that up to 75. It's a little better, I guess. All right. So, okay. So ketamine had been evaluated for as a potential treatment for depression, and it also has hallucinogenic properties, but they're quite different relative to those of psilocybin, and they're completely distinct pharmacologically. But ketamine has been found to have some efficacy in the treatment of depression for some people. And so, to be clear, they're specifically describing like the efficacy of treating ketamine treating depression. And so here's what they say, quote, ketamine effects typically last for a few days to 2 weeks, whereas the current study showed that clinically significant antidepressant response to psilocybin therapy persisted for at least 4 weeks, with 71% of participants continuing to show a clinically significant response at week 4 of follow-up. So that was the comparison, right? Psilocybin seemed to have a more sustained beneficial effect, and they identified, by the way, that anything over a 50% reduction in clinical evaluation of the severity of depression, that's widely used to evaluate depression as like a significant response. And once again, this was at the 4-week follow-up point. So. They highlight a few additional features of psilocybin that are distinct from ketamine. Most importantly, there's a pretty low adverse event profile, including a pretty low potential for addiction, and that can be different for ketamine. And then they also note that their findings reflect the antidepressant effects among cancer patients who were psychologically suffering, along with a study of a smaller study of patients with treatment-resistant depression. So it's sort of the results from this clinical trial sort of comport with things that have been found in, sort of somewhat analogous studies. And so in comparison to typical antidepressant treatments, Alan Davis, who's the first author on this study, was quoted as saying, quote, "The magnitude of the effect we saw was about 4 times larger than what clinical trials have shown for traditional antidepressants on the market." So it's pretty substantial. And then later he says, because most other depression treatments take 3 weeks or months to work, may have undesirable effects, this could be a game changer if these findings hold up in future gold standard placebo-controlled clinical trials, right? So this is sort of like a baby clinical trial, but it's pretty stringent and a good number of people. Okay, and then another quote from Davis. So the effect happened within 1 day after the first session and sustained at that reduced level through the second psilocybin session all the way up to the 1-month follow-up. And so they also explore a possible, what they call transdiagnostic mechanism of action, given the evidence that's been collected that suggests that it may be clinically useful in the treatment of tobacco and alcohol use disorders. And, like personally, I'd like to see quite a few more like larger scale studies to be really confident in that. But the studies that they cite, and you can check out the study, I think it is open access. So the studies that they cite, like alcohol dependence treatment, the alcohol dependence treatment study that they cite is pretty interesting. But there's like no doubt that there is evidence for this molecule being useful in a psychiatric setting or clinical setting. And so Dr. Roland Griffiths, professor of neuropsychopharmacology of consciousness at Johns Hopkins, obviously one of the coolest professorships in the world, he said, quote, because there are several types of major depressive disorders that may result in variation in how people respond to treatment, right? I was surprised that most of our study participants found the psilocybin treatment to be effective. So in other words, what he's saying is that, like, given the fact that there are, depression comes in many shapes and sizes, he expected that some people would respond much better than others. And that there was a fairly consistent positive reaction here. So, a pretty meaningful issue with this study, to get to the sort of disadvantages, is that all of the participants were told that they were, at the very least, eventually going to get it, right? So it's not like they were told you may or may not be getting psilocybin. So there's the possibility that everybody benefited from just expecting that their symptoms would improve at some point. Given the result of the study, though, this limitation would without question be eliminated by including like more participants and including a typical placebo group, which could be tricky because, it's pretty obvious when somebody's taking psilocybin. But so where does this study leave us? First of all, it's clearly not a recommendation that just taking psilocybin or psilocybin-containing mushrooms, magic mushrooms, whatever you want to call them, on its own would be an effective treatment, right? This was like a very clearly controlled and very consistent treatment strategy. It was also, a very specific group of people who were suffering from depression. So, it's absolutely not an indication that like psilocybin on its own is a cure for the condition on its own, right? But it does suggest that at a minimum, this substance and related substances, frankly, within this family of substances, they deserve to be explored further for any potential efficacy for the treatment of depression and other mood-related psychiatric conditions, because like right now, we really need some new options for the treatment of these conditions, particularly in the United States, but throughout the world. And we've been pretty limited to just a sort of restricted pharmacological set, right? Most antidepressants have essentially not the same, but very, very similar pharmacological activity. And they are quite effective for some people, but not very effective for a lot of people. And so having other options like ketamine, like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is another treatment modality that's been explored, and potentially psilocybin or other sort of serotonergic, psychedelic substances, it's worth exploring, having more tools in the armamentarium for the treatment of mood-related psychiatric conditions. All right, that's what I have for you today. Kind of short, I know. What's going on here? It was compelling. It was interesting. Made a big splash among people who pay attention to these kinds of studies of these types of substances. And so, yeah, I'm hoping that we'll see a lot more. Plus, it's coming out of Johns Hopkins and Ohio State, and so that we're seeing those kinds of institutions. I know that there are similar studies going on at NYU, New York University, the medical school there, Langone Medical School, and so it's exciting. It's positive. It's progress. All right, now the color on this looks just atrocious. I am so sorry about that. But I don't want to monkey around with it too much, just because, well, let's see what happens if I do. Whoa! We're glowing. No, let's try that. Ugh. Maybe this. Sorry, you're sort of seeing me troubleshoot this in real time. I apologize for that. Let's see, maybe nothing with the lights. Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. It's still kind of bright. I'm sorry about this. Very awkward. All right. Okay, we'll just leave it right there. How about that? How about that? I'm old enough to remember that meme. All right. Hello, Joy. Armamentarium for the win. It's very dramatic. Sky and terrible lighting. Yeah, I know. This is a little better. I think this is acceptable. All right, why don't we start the live half? Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I forgot to do what I always do. I forgot to do what I always forget to do. My name is Ian McLaughlin. I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania. I studied addiction and mood-related regulation by the brain, specifically anxiety, but not just anxiety, just negative affect, negative emotional processes. I tried to map out a part of the collections of neurons communicating with other collections of neurons that regulate those things. On YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, I just talked about probably the most substantial clinical trial to date of psilocybin for the treatment of depression, for like major depression. Came out of Johns Hopkins and Ohio State University. And it was an interesting study design, probably one of the more ethical study designs if you're concerned about whether or not people are going to get adequate treatment. It was a waitlist controlled study, and so everybody eventually got it. So that's both a drawback and arguably a strength of the study. And yeah, check it out, youtube.com/anthropoid. Right as I said, I forgot to do this thing. I forgot while I was forgetting, which is pretty impressive, if you ask me. Log in, Twitter. So how are you all doing? Hey man, good to see you. I have a question. Is there a way to increase the GABA dominance in your brain? That is an interesting, that's an interesting way to phrase this. Wait, hold on. Okay. Oh my God, this is just a disaster. Okay, here we go. Here we go. So, first of all, GABA, just so everybody's on the same page, GABA is the nervous system's principal inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's sort of like something like an off switch. What is going on? Okay. Terrible. This is awful. Okay, here we go. All right, got it. Here we go. So a neuron, right? We have about 86 billion neurons, and at any one moment there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of neurons firing. And whether or not a neuron, generally speaking, this is very broadly speaking, whether or not a neuron is going to fire an impulse, or what we call an action potential, is, very simplistically speaking, the byproduct of how much either GABA or its sort of its opposition, it's sort of the nervous system's principal excitatory neurotransmitter, how much either GABA or glutamate is dominating at any given moment. It's far more complicated than that, believe me, but we can sort of simplify this. We can simplify that like down to just GABA and glutamate, sort of like a tug of war. If GABA is winning, a neuron's unlikely to fire an impulse or an action potential. If glutamate is winning, then it's probably going to fire. So, broadly speaking, here's, if you'll permit me to sort of infer a little bit. I suspect that, generally speaking, people would associate GABA with medications or substances that are GABAergic pharmacologically. So they either amplify GABA signaling, they make GABA receptors more sensitive to GABA. In other words, it's sort of like cranking up the volume on that signal of GABA. And so these are drugs like, alprazolam or Xanax, diazepam or Valium. But then alcohol, for example, has GABAergic activity. It's far more complicated than just GABAergic, but it has GABAergic activity. There's a lot. Barbiturates have GABAergic activity. And generally speaking, those drugs, those medications, tend to be what we call anxiolytic, or they reduce anxiety. And just broadly speaking, what they do is just sort of across the whole brain, they reduce neural activity. It is definitely the case that if you have insufficient GABAergic signaling, that is a bad and dangerous state of affairs in the brain. And in fact, early on in life, early on in development, there can be instances where children develop epilepsy. Epilepsy is where people have seizures recurrently, and they can grow out of that. And generally speaking, that is because when we're younger, we have far more glutamatergic activity, far more excitatory activity. And then as we age, that domination by glutamate and excitatory signaling begins to attenuate as we lose a lot of synapses. Those synapses are pruned away. And so they can grow out of those seizures because there's just not as much excitatory activity as there once was when they were younger. But here's the thing. The brain is sort of like an adaptation engine, right? So the brain has mechanisms that regulate how much GABA is being released at any given moment in any given part of the brain, or how much glutamate is being released. And you could simplify a lot of psychiatric conditions by saying, for one reason or another, that balance has been disrupted. So, for example, for a very long time, one of the prevailing models of autism was that there was insufficient GABAergic activity, or too much. So, again, autism is more complicated than that. But the point is that your goal shouldn't be to ever amplify the activity of any one neurotransmitter. First of all, you can't really do that. Like, there's no way to do that without essentially taking a drug that exists today, like Xanax, where you're just rendering that system more sensitive to GABA. you wouldn't want to do that. I would imagine you have some goal. Maybe you feel like you're too anxious all the time, or you feel like you would be better suited at any given task if you're more calm. But the issue there is that just amplifying the activity of one neurotransmitter is not going to get you there. You should be more concerned with focusing on developing expertise in that task, and letting the brain, go through the motions that it needs to go through to develop that expertise, right? To either become, calmer in any given situation, or get treatment, which could involve pharmacotherapy, alprazolam, and so on. But optimally, you also receive some kind of psychotherapy, because the goal is to literally adjust the brain such that you achieve some therapeutic end, right? So all of this to say that nothing that we care about really in the brain, unless you're like working in a lab like I did, nothing that you care about in the brain is the byproduct of any one neurotransmitter. It's always the byproduct of a whole sort of symphony of signaling that is all occurring, and it's all very complicated and can be dissonant, it can be harmonious. But so focusing in on any one signal, unless your question is what is GABA doing in this very specific instance, unless that's your question, focusing in on any one neurotransmitter isn't going to yield the answers or the insights that you're really interested in. And I say this as somebody who got into neuroscience as, when I was younger, when I was in college, before I even thought I could ever go into neuroscience, I was sort of a stamp collector. Like I really wanted to learn all of the pharmacological activities of psilocybin, like I talked about on YouTube, or alprazolam, or caffeine. One of the first questions I ever asked myself was, so caffeine is a stimulant. We call caffeine a stimulant. Why is it a stimulant? And then you can go into the direct, acute pharmacological activity. Well, it is a adenosine receptor antagonist. So it prevents this neurotransmitter, adenosine, it's actually an amino acid as well, from binding its receptor, the adenosine receptor. Okay, but why is that stimulating? Well, it has sort of downstream consequences. Well, first of all, it's because adenosine builds up during the day, and that is one of the ways that your brain sort of keeps track of time. You get more and more tired as the levels of adenosine build up, and so if you prevent the brain from even seeing the clock, then you are tricked into thinking that you have more energy than you otherwise would. Yeah, but why is that stimulating? Like, what is the mechanism that makes it stimulating? Oh, well, downstream, this results in elevated catecholamine releases, norepinephrine, dopamine, epinephrine, and on you go. It's this big rabbit hole. But ultimately, the answer to that question is about, if you really want to know the answer, it's because a very specific set of neurons in very specific parts of the brain are communicating with other very specific neurons that then alter the way that other neurons in the brain, as you step through the network, are behaving. So that was a very long answer, I know, but it's sort of, it touched so many parts of why I'm interested in this field in the first place. And so yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about trying to amplify GABA activity specifically. Thank you so much for helping me out. It's my pleasure, James. Yeah, thanks for asking, man. Do you analyze the mental processes of libtards? What's funny about that term, libtards, is that like right now, so I work in science policy now, but right now, libtards, and it's actually kind of fallen out of vogue, hasn't it? I haven't seen it too much, like recently, but like during certainly like '08 and like that sort of time period, it was very, very common. But what's funny is that term libtards was first used or deployed by Republicans to describe libertarians when, way back in the day, we're talking decades ago now, but then it was sort of like, it evolved, as all words do, to mostly refer to conservatives or Republicans will use to denigrate I guess liberals or Democrats or something like that. It's just kind of funny how that word completely changed. Oh, cool. It looks like Daryl's calling in. Awesome. So Daryl, a longtime friend from Canada. Of course I don't have a pen. Of course I don't. So Daryl, what's up, man? What's on your mind?
Hey, how are you doing, Ian?
I'm not doing bad. I'm doing as good as one can hope to do these days. How about you?
I'm doing okay, and I hope this isn't like too off topic, but I had recently told a friend that I don't believe in free will, and that I believe everything is predetermined.
Okay.
And then he came up with he tried to postulate that I had like chosen this belief to like absolve myself of accountability and responsibility, and I contested that by saying, well, no, because my brain is still capable of processing my role in any series of events and calculating the appropriate moral response.
Mm-hmm.
And
so you want, like, how would I react to in that situation? Yeah. So first of all, that's great. I love hearing that when people are having these kinds of neurophilosophical discussions. And the reason for that, I think, is that, free will is one of those things, one of those topics where, I think having training in neuroscience is very, very helpful because you can point to very specific examples, but not exclusively. Like, people, have insights from all kinds of training and just life experience when it comes to this question. And of course, we've sort of gone on this journey together, right? Yeah. So first of all, that is the argument that you received is actually a very, very commonly deployed argument by philosophers and by people who, generally speaking, believe in free will. It's sort of what you might call a utilitarian argument, in that if we don't have free will, right? If we are not the drivers of our ships, then how could you blame anybody for anything, right? If, like, you commit some crime of passion, you attack the guy who's cheating, with your wife or something like that, like, how could you blame that person, him, for having done that if he was always going to do that anyways? And from my perspective, it doesn't absolve, like, whether or not we have free will doesn't really make a huge material difference to your day-to-day life, because we certainly feel like we have free will at a very minimum, right? I think that's pretty uncontroversial. And by the way, like, some philosophers will argue just that feeling that we have it ought not be discounted, right? We ought to consider that. But so for me, in terms of day-to-day life, like, no, it doesn't absolve you of anything, because all of the mechanisms that guide behavior are still active during any given decision that you make, right? The emotional, rudder, the sort of emotional impulses, the past experiences, the memories, the socializations that you've received growing up, and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think it has any consequence for, like, personal accountability, or that kind of thing, or like how you make any given decision, right? Because it is immaterial to your day-to-day life experience. I think it matters. It does matter. It makes a very significant difference when it comes to criminal law, right? Where, so if we accept that some people, due to chance and circumstance, they were born in certain social situations, they inherited certain genetics and neuronal anatomy and all that kind of stuff. If we accept that they are therefore the byproduct of and their behavior are the byproduct of things outside of their control, then I think basing a legal system on like retribution and culpability doesn't really make sense. Rather, we should base it on minimizing, the sort of social ramifications. So, the prospect that this person, for whatever reason, will continue, exhibiting this, what we consider to be a criminal act. So for me, like, in terms of, to get right down to it, like, for me, that we don't have free will, or that we don't have free will in the way that we popularly conceive of it, doesn't really change how I'm going to decide what I'm going to eat for dinner, right? It's not like, there's a list somewhere that I can go to, and the complexity is so great that you probably could, if you had a perfect physics engine, predict what I'm going to eat, but we're not even remotely close to that. And so therefore, just act as if you have it, and, you can still blame people for being mean or whatever, being abusive, but just in the back of your mind, for me, it engenders a bit of empathy that, like, when I see road rage, for example, I'm driving on highways fairly regularly these days, which is awful, in Philadelphia. When I see road rage, I'm just like, there, but for the grace of God, go I, right? So, it's like, they are late for work, or they had an argument, or, whatever. They were abused by their father or something like that. And so I recognize that empathy, and then just go about my day, as though no material change has occurred in my life. But so what was your response to that argument?
Well, just on a calculator to come up with the correct response to a mathematical problem. My brain is capable of processing my role in any series of events and calculate the appropriate moral response.
Yeah, I mean, so yes. I mean, I think that is definitely true, right? You know, we know that if certain parts of the brain are injured by like a stroke, for example, the ability for people to empathize, like literally empathy, can deteriorate. It is like sensitive to changes in neuroanatomy. And so like just because the activities of those brain regions are largely sculpted by genetics and environment, are entirely sculpted by genetics and environment, you know, doesn't mean that the activities of those neurons don't guide your behavior, right? They're still guiding your behavior. And yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right there. You know, I would only add that like, it doesn't, you know, for me, it doesn't change how I experience decision making or free will. Rather, it just changes my understanding of my actions and free will.
Yeah, like it like my change in this particular belief doesn't change like the intensity of love I have for like other people or my wife, for example, or my sense of guilt or morality, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to quickly ask you about like he pointed out like we were talking about these like lab studies where, as I understand them, they find a signal in the brain, and before a person is even consciously aware of a thought or an action, and his argument was, well, we don't know what that signal, how that signal, if that signal is related to that conscious action or thought.
So I mean, so yeah, so you're certainly right that there are studies that have attempted to do that. So for example, I think the most famous were conducted by, I believe, a Canadian neuroscientist named Benjamin Lebet. I believe I could be wrong about that. Maybe just the French name sort of made me assume he's Canadian, but and so those are some of the earliest studies where basically they could detect like a very, you know, discrete signal. You know, and this was in very, very simple tasks where people were like just sitting down and they were told to like, at any moment, whenever you want, press a button or press this button or press that, you know, button on your left, button on your right. And they were able to predict when the person was going to execute the action and which button they were going to press by measuring that signal that preceded their activity, so their action. So those studies have been criticized, sort of along the lines of what your debate partner brought up. Also, that, you know, that just there are other studies that have pursued that kind of experimental design that are conducted a little bit more rigorously. But basically, what your friend is arguing is what I suspect a philosopher named David Chalmers would argue, which is, you know, yes, you can tell me that these neurons in this very specific, you know, neighborhood of the brain are responsible or control your ability to like move your finger like this, right? You can tell me that and I'll believe you. And, you know, the correlation of activity in these neurons and the movement of the finger can be so tight, so perfect, and very, very convincing. But what Chalmers would say is that you still haven't told me how all of consciousness, all of these discrete parts of the brain, movement, mood, vision, you know, memory, all these things, how they're all bound together to generate consciousness. Now, personally, I think that argument has fallen. It has gone from very, very popular to fallen quite out of favor among most of the neuroscience community, because basically at a certain point you're asking a question, you're asking for an answer that need not exist, right? Like, you know, if the mind, if consciousness is an emergent property of all of these, you know, discrete parts of the brain interacting with one another in very specific manners, with very specialized activity, if consciousness emerges from that, that's the answer. Like, the answer is, it is all of these networks of neurons interacting with one another that generates consciousness. And, you know, so what your friend could argue is that, like, you still haven't proven to me that with 100% certainty, or with, you know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, right, that those are the neurons that either control the decision to press a button or whatever, or that control those those motor actions, you can make that argument. And it is true that like a lot of neuroscience is correlative at a certain point. But for me, I think that the ability for neuroscience to predict, any given behavior and explain it, but to predict it, I think has reached a point where we can put a fair bit of confidence into the studies that we point to understand these types of decision-making, activities and that kind of thing. And like, I don't want to go on and on here, but like, that argument does strike me as totally valid and frankly intuitive. But it is essentially asking somebody to provide a level of evidence that isn't applied to really any other science. And is like, it's just a standard that's so high that essentially no scientist could meet that standard. And so therefore, it's sort of an unfair argument to make, I guess is sort of what I'm saying. Like, I'll just give you an example, like black holes, right? For the longest time, they were like a theoretical thing that could potentially exist. I think, was it Stephen Hawking who predicted their existence. And, fairly recently, a female astronomer, collected some data that proved that there was something like a black hole out there. And it was all indirect data because, of course, you can't see black holes. Well, you could say, well, wait a second, you haven't proven that those are black holes. You haven't shown me that there's a black hole. And so, okay, well then, that's a position that's a very hard line position to take, but it is a defensible position and one for which there's really no reasonable argument, right? Again, you're asking for a standard like... Go ahead.
Because what I understand of the brain is that there's a part of the brain, like call it the subconscious, that really forms the thoughts, and then those thoughts are broadcasted into our conscious mind, our conscious part of the brain, and I even think like there's a lot of work being done in our subconscious, because when you form a sentence, you're not thinking like what do these words mean and how do I put these words together? I mean, you just speak the sentence like it's natural, but obviously there has to be a lot of work going on underneath that, that's putting all this information together so you can just fluently communicate, right?
Well, Daryl, you're speaking my language, man. Yeah, absolutely. Like, so I would hesitate to put like a hard division between like where a thought is generated. A thought is complicated and it evolves as it, whatever we're considering to be a thought, right? It evolves as it's sort of, as it's affected by all the different brain regions that are, you could think of a thought like a song, right? Or maybe a chord on a piano with many, many notes. And it can be the same chord, but you can alter it, right? You can make it a minor chord or a major chord or, a diminished chord or something just by adding one, a note here and there. And you could imagine a thought or an experience or, et cetera, being similarly regulated by, all the different brain regions. But, that said, I think the by far the majority of neuroscientists would agree with that model where, consciousness itself is we're only aware of a very, very small fraction of the totality of our, of the processes that underlie our consciousness. And so one metaphor that I've seen used that I think is pretty good is you could think of consciousness as an iceberg, right? And as we all know, you can see icebergs, but the only part that you can see is the part above the water. And the vast majority, just because of how buoyancy works, the vast majority of the iceberg, the mass of that ice, is underwater. And so, you can imagine the subconscious processes as being the parts that are underwater, whereas your conscious awareness, the parts of which you are, consciously aware, are the the sort of the final. You're dotting the I's and crossing the T's, on a sentence that's already been written, kind of. So yeah, I mean, I dig that model. You guys are having interesting conversations.
And I think, thank you. I think too, what builds an excellent case for hard determinism is the fact that just an imbalance in neurotransmitter chemicals can literally affect our mood and our feelings and our thoughts.
Absolutely.
That we're just absolute prey to that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're either the prey or the beneficiaries of that, right? Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, for me, like at heart, I started out as, what's called a neuropharmacologist, where, the tools in our toolbox, our armamentarium, if you will, are pharmacological tools, are substances, drugs. And I think that they are such a powerful model because you can not only design a molecule to bind a very specific part of the brain, a very specific protein within the brain, receptor, or neurotransmitter trafficker or whatever, something like that. You can not only design a drug and predict that it'll bind this thing, but you can also predict the effects of that without ever having, seen the effects of the drug in the first place. So, just to give you a more hardcore example, I could design a drug that binds the 5-HT2A receptor. It's a type of serotonin receptor to which psilocybin, mescaline, LSD, they all bind, right? I could design a drug that does that nobody's ever seen before. And I could, give it to some, victim of my mad science, and I could predict the kinds of effects that they would likely experience. Not with 100% accuracy, but pretty close. And so, for me, there's your evidence of like a pretty deterministic relationship between brain activity and consciousness.
Yeah, like the fact that a chemical can literally shape human behavior.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
But thanks for having me on, Ian. I really appreciate this. This was my first time in your broadcast, I believe.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, thanks for calling in. Hope to talk to you again.
Okay, take care of yourself.
You too. Stay safe. All right, so on YouTube, glutathione. We can talk about glutathione if you'd like. Yeah, okay. So this is youtube.com/anthropoid. Earlier tonight, I talked about a clinical trial of psilocybin, the active ingredient of magic mushrooms, psychedelic hallucinogen, for the treatment of severe depression. Well, actually, moderate to severe depression. Clinical trial done at Johns Hopkins and Ohio State University, but it was actually conducted at Johns Hopkins. youtube.com/anthropoid. And so we can talk about glutathione if you like. I mean, glutathione, it has a lot of properties. I would imagine most people wouldn't be familiar with it in its roles in transcription and translation, but it also has properties as like an antioxidant molecule. I think it. Oh man, I'm forgetting. It's a methyl donor. So for certain biochemical reactions, glutathione can either can be actually absolutely crucial, or they can make them a little bit more effective, more efficient. And I remember back in the day, a while back, and I'm sure people still do this. People would use glutathione as like a hangover prevention tool. Because evidently some of the metabolism of alcohol that occurs in the liver requires a methyl donor, and glutathione could be that donor. But yeah, beyond that, I'm not quite sure what about it you're interested in. Mad Cow says, I've seen libtard, trumptard, and qtard floating around. Yeah, those are the new ones, I guess. I like the idea of free will. Yeah, the prefrontal cortex, seems to be able to override certain impulses in civilized people. Mad Cow, that is the theory not only described by, but I think most importantly described by, my favorite neurophilosopher, one of my favorite neuro people in the world, Patricia Churchland. I think that she is, almost always exactly right, and she's a much better writer than I could ever be, and very, very brilliant. But I think she's wrong about that one, unfortunately. So she doesn't actually use the term free won't. She basically she says the whole conversation about free will is so like fraught with personal emotional devotions and spiritual connotations and that kind of stuff, that I think that she would probably say that the concept of hard libertarian, not the political libertarian, but hard libertarian free will doesn't make sense. But then she focuses in on the regulation of decision making, right, which is the thing that humans do, whether it's predetermined or not. And you're right, she hones in on the prefrontal cortex and frontal lobe activity in general to inhibit some of the urges and compulsions that arise, generally speaking, from the more sort of evolutionarily primitive, older parts of the brain. But for me, it's all part of the same system, right? So we know, for example, that the like prefrontal cortical volume can be different among people who are diagnosed with severe ADHD and those without. And we know that people can grow out of ADHD as they mature, and there have been studies that have shown that the volume in the prefrontal cortex changes to more reflect that of people without ADHD, and those who, remitters, let's call them, and then those who, sustain the ADHD, their PFC, their prefrontal cortex doesn't change as much. It does grow, but not as much. And so, for me, it's like, all of that is genetically regulated. All of that is subject to the life experiences that you've had growing up, injuries that you might have had, damage, from concussions or those kinds of things. And so for me, I wouldn't put that in a separate category. I think she's absolutely right. You are absolutely right that, that process is quintessentially human, first of all, but it's critical to understanding human behavior. But for me, it doesn't really provide evidence at all to contradict the non-existence of free will. But on the road, people seem to be in more of a fight or flight type of mindset. You can always tell. Here in Philly, people are either really cool and they'll just let you in, in the absurdly cramped highways with like on-ramps that are like the size of you could hop across it. And then some people are just nuts. And I actually, a couple weeks ago, I had that experience where you're watching somebody driving like a complete idiot, just weaving and no indicators, nothing. And I'm like, that dude is going to get into an accident. And by the way, we know it was a dude, right? Sure enough, 20 minutes later, I'm passing an accident. I'm stuck in a ton of traffic. And then I ultimately get to their car, or this person's car. And it was on the side of the road. Yeah. So, every now and then you get people like that. But hey, I grew up in Miami. And I lived in Los Angeles, or just outside of Los Angeles. And it's bad here, but it's way worse there. Okay, so Niruguru, what about Jungian unconscious? My acupuncture doctor gave me that B12. And she said that I had a hot liver. Just wondered why it cleared my anxiety. Best explanation of free will and neuroscience ever. Well, I thank you. I don't know I hope you were describing mine, but so I have to be honest. I'm not I definitely read Carl Jung. In college, and I found it to be interesting, like some interesting ideas, but I would have to review them again to sort of update. For me, I've never really seen an explanation from somebody whose sole training is in either psychology or in philosophy, just because you don't have the tools to describe this engine that creates the thing that you're trying to describe, right? It would be like trying to understand how a combustion engine works, how a car drives, with only an understanding of like geometry. Like it's good to know geometry. It helps. You can understand parts of it 100% for sure, but you're kind of missing the main game here. But hey, I do need to review to really be a competent critic there. Okay, I know I've missed a lot of messages. Oh, thank you so much for the super hearts. I believe that was Dark Swan, if I'm not incorrect. Thank you so much, Emma. I appreciate that for the super hearts. I'm wondering if you have any advice on great books to read for adult with ADHD inattentive type. Joel, I don't. I don't know. I should say I don't know any books that are like for the popular press. I've only ever read reviews or actual studies that were conducted by scientists, essentially, written for and conducted by scientists. If you want, you can reach out. I'm sure some of those reviews, or at least one of them, would be intelligible to you. So I'd be happy if you want to reach out on Twitter. I could send it over if you're interested. You can reach out on Twitter. It's _anthropoid. Gosh, this is the first time that I've done YouTube at night. Oh, that's better, sort of. Gosh. This is so difficult. Let's see. What does that do? Ugh, that's terrible. Okay. We are having another caller. It's always nice to be able to actually hear somebody's voice when you're interacting with them. It's far more intuitive and human interaction, I find at least. Looks like we might be having trouble connecting, though, unfortunately. So, Irene Swift, I recognize you. Sorry, you're going to have to try harder. Hey, Jen. Oh, my gosh. If you're still in here. Jen, how is Alfie doing? I was just thinking about you guys the other day. Jen Bocock. I was just thinking about Alfie. Who was I talking to? Yeah. I recalled the sort of early interactions that we had. Alfie's a young, precocious guy who has interest in science, and his mom, Jen, interacted with us, or with me. I interact with them. Okay, Ian. As we get older, why do we get forgetful? Are there brain cells disappearing? Salvatore's. That's a great question. So first of all, yeah, that is possible. That you can lose neurons, and generally speaking, when you lose a neuron, it doesn't come back. It's not replaced. Not always. There are exceptions, but by and large, that's the case. And so, of course, you can have injuries. You can, of course, have pharmacological injuries where you consume too much of a given drug. All of those things can deteriorate literal numbers of neurons. And then also there are parts of the brain that are relevant to memory, in fact, where neurogenesis does occur. So meaning that new neurons are created. And so we're talking about regions like, the dentate gyrus or the hippocampus, for example, which would have some relevance to memory. And that the rate of neurogenesis can decline as we get older. There have actually been some really interesting studies that explore like what exactly the ramifications of that are. Like, for example, it's not exclusively memory. It may not even be memory at all, but it's not exclusively memory. For example, mood regulation can change. People can become, or I should say, preclinical models exhibit greater levels of anxiety. But anyway, so that the rate of neurogenesis where neurogenesis does occur, where new neurons are created, declines. But on top of the loss of neurons, there are also other things that happen to neurons and within neurons that can affect their processing. So for example, like one of the classic ones is, you can think of the surface of a neuron as like a swimming pool full of olive oil or some kind of oil, right? So it's kind of viscous and it moves, it's fluid, and you can throw like floaties and stuff, rafts on top, and then they can move along the surface. That's kind of what a neuron is like, and even a synapse. Receptors can move, ion channels that regulate whether or not a neuron's going to fire an impulse can move. Things are dynamic. And as we get older, it would be like you're making that olive oil more and more viscous, thicker and thicker and harder for things to move across them. And that's what happens in neurons. That the membrane of neurons itself, the body of the neuron itself, becomes more and more rigid, and it's actually a byproduct of changing levels of types of cholesterol that are actually integrated into neurons. And so that can have an effect on how effectively those neurons can communicate with other neurons and adapt and respond and create new receptors and that kind of thing. There is a deterioration in the efficacy of a type of neuron called spindle neurons that help to connect, essentially, to allow signaling from the forebrain to reach the mid and hindbrain. Those neurons can become less effective. So there's this whole, there's a bunch of things. And then, of course, as we get older, things like, neurons are some of the oldest cells in your body by far. There are neurons that you've had since probably you were in the womb. And so, essentially every cell in the body, when they're creating new proteins, when they're, creating neurotransmitters or, creating new synapses and stuff like that, they're the little mechanisms, little enzymes and enzymes that create those reactions can make errors. They're error prone, just like anything else. They're remarkably accurate, but they do make errors. And those errors, we have our neurons, our cells have mechanisms to catch those errors and correct them. But if they continue happening and if the rate of error increases, those mechanisms can be insufficient. And so the byproduct of those errors, misfolded proteins, these types of things, can begin to build up. And that, for example, is part of the way that people develop Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. But you don't have to have overt dementia to have that happen and have it have some ramifications for function. But you just don't pass that threshold where you have a formal diagnosis of dementia. And so a bunch of things, a bunch of domains of activity change as we get older, generally speaking for the worse. And so what is there will almost certainly be treatments for that to sort of correct or prevent those errors from occurring. But really the best thing you can do is to just keep challenging your brain, keep making sure that you're challenging it to solve new problems, introducing it to new information, making sure that, you know, your environment isn't too rote, isn't too mundane, isn't too, you know, repetitive, right? Where you're interacting with people, at least on a regular basis. As we get older, certainly in the United States, but I assume this is true outside of the United States, elderly populations can begin to become socially isolated. And in fact, I'm actually working on a bill that would require at least the residents of New Jersey to be the beneficiary of a more articulate and explicit plan to avoid social isolation for members of the elderly community. But anyways, we know that social isolation is like one of the main things that can cause, that can exacerbate dementia. And so, you know, that can happen a lot in long-term care facilities and in nursing homes and stuff. And so, you know, we certainly don't want to exacerbate any underlying problems that you know, rendered those types of care necessary in the first place. So, you know, avoid social isolation, you know, have a dynamic sort of repertoire of stimuli that you're feeding into the brain. And, you know, that there are others like exercise, moderate intensity exercise a couple times a week, about 30 minutes long. Good is a good idea. And there are others. I'm happy to go into more. Alfie, if you remember from a few years ago, is watching your live videos. Yes, I remember. Yeah, he's autistic, but clearly quite high functioning. Well, say hi for me to both of you. It's really lovely to hear from you. I think I was talking about like some of the positive things about social media, and you know, how fortunate and grateful I am to be able to like interact with folks like you. Because otherwise I would just be stuck around a bunch of scientists. Okay, awesome topics. Can cold water immersion release chemicals that help with Alzheimer's? Evolver Man, super interesting topic. So at first glance, you know, the obvious, like the intuitive answer would be no, right? That you know, the mechanisms that are guiding Alzheimer's disease are so far removed from the things that happen in the body when you're exposed to very radical changes in temperature that there wouldn't be a kind of beneficial effect there. But there are these types of enzymes, proteins, called essentially they're chaperones, but heat shock proteins. And I should note that for Alzheimer's disease, we don't know exactly what's really causing Alzheimer's disease. We have a pretty good idea that it has to do with amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, both sort of like, you know, like how lint grows in your pockets, right? It just sort of appears there for some reason. It's because, you know, the cloth on the inside of the pocket is scraping against, you know, itself, and then it breaks into little fibers, and then those fibers, there's a nucleation fiber, and then those fibers begin to grow into, you know, dust bunnies or whatever you want to call them. Similar type of process with amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, where you have this sort of slow, although it can be rapid, growth of what we call aggregates, just gunk, on both the insides of neurons, neurofibrillary tangles, and on the outsides of neurons, amyloid beta plaques. And those things, those aggregates, are the byproduct of that kind of a process where you have poorly folded, or as it say, poorly cut proteins that are hyper sticky. You could think of it that way. And so as a result, they interact with one another and begin growing. And so one of the things that exposure to, you know, very, very low temperatures, you know, cryotherapy, that type of thing, or saunas, very, very high temperatures, one of the things that those types of exposures do is essentially they kick essentially the entirety of your body into survival mode, right? And it's really interesting. I mean, you could put it into the same category as like why fasting, intermittent fasting, you know, caloric restriction in general, has been shown to be essentially the most consistent tool or strategy to extend lifespan in essentially every organism. It's that there are a bunch of mechanisms, compensatory, sort of like housekeeping mechanisms that reside in all of our cells, that when I was describing like the errors that pile up as we get older, those mechanisms that can check, they're like housekeepers that can check for errors and correct them, those are all parts of a sort of a survival reaction. And so, you know, caloric restriction, you know, intermittent fasting, that kind of thing. But then also exposure to radical temperatures can activate those pathways. So there's like DNA error correction mechanisms that can be activated. There are heat shock proteins that can essentially activate pathways that will recognize misfolded proteins and either get rid of them or correct them. So whether or not it would be beneficial for Alzheimer's disease or dementia, I've never seen a study that explicitly studies that thing, like that potential application. I wouldn't be surprised if there might be some kind of beneficial effect, but because there's no evidence to which I can point, confidently, I would have to say maybe. It probably couldn't hurt. That's the best I could give you. Okay, can you? Oh yeah, we already talked about that. Oh wow, I'm so far behind. Okay, I'm gonna go right up to the most recent. Urban Dictionary has a completely different definition of brains. That's possible. Okay. Well, no, I mean the definition of brain isn't actually up for debate, unless I guess Urban Dictionary, right? All right, is Elon Musk trying to control our brains? I don't think so. If your head is big, do you have a bigger brain? Chris So Calm. Awesome topic. So first of all, head size can correlate with brain size. In humans, generally speaking, probably not, right? Most of what causes people's heads to be bigger or smaller are probably like the sort of auxiliary, structures of the skull, your brow, your chin, these types of things, how much water your sort of musculature and skin is retaining, these types of things. But I should also note that having a bigger brain does not equate to being more intelligent or more sort of effective, cognitively effective. And in fact, for like severe Alzheimer's, severe autism, there tends to be a larger brain size than in those without. So, don't act awesome. So yeah, but there is a correlation. And like, for example, like elephants, African bush elephants have much bigger brains than we have, way more neurons, something like 256, something like that, 259 billion neurons. We have only 86 billion. Blue whales have bigger brains than we do. But we have a big and fancier neocortex than they have, right? They have, I think, something like 7 billion neurons in their neocortex. We have something like 15 billion. So there might be some magic secret sauce to having that fancy of a neocortex that enables us to have just a more versatile consciousness than that of elephants. Elephants are pretty intelligent, by the way. I mean, their consciousness is nothing to sneeze at, but I think it's fairly uncontroversial to suggest that humans, at least our cognitive processes and our intelligence and versatility is greater. Okay. Can meditation help you use a higher percent of your brain? So Chris So Calm, first of all, I envy you that you're so calm. But second of all, can meditation help the brain? So, when you say help the brain, that's like a very broad kind of thing, right? Let's define help the brain as help to avoid, anxiety, help to, have better sleep, these types of things. I'm going to just define that as help the brain rather than like some kind of chemical, biochemical beneficial effect. Although, actually for the biochemical one, there have been studies that show that mindfulness meditation, specifically like a specific regimen for a couple weeks, was shown to be associated with reduced levels of cortisol, glucocorticoids, which are sort of stress hormones. They're involved in the stress response. And we know that chronic exposure to elevated cortisol does have deleterious effects within the brain, reducing synaptogenesis, reducing hippocampal volume, these types of things. So that is a direct benefit. But in terms of like the sort of the benefits that I think we're mostly interested in, right? Meditation, there are studies that have shown mindfulness meditation in particular to reduce levels of like fairly severe anxiety. Another study that was conducted at Johns Hopkins, actually, in addition to the one that I talked about on YouTube today, youtube.com/anthropoid, about whether or not psilocybin, a clinical trial was conducted to discover whether or not psilocybin, the active ingredient of mushrooms, magic mushrooms, hallucinogenic mushrooms, could be an effective treatment for depression. So you can check that out, youtube.com/anthropoid. Anyway, I'm a big proponent of mindfulness meditation. So, I have a question. Is Biden a peacemaker? I couldn't tell you. I can't read his brain. Can you give shorter answers? I don't have all day. Well, it sounds like Chris So Calm needs to calm down. And I look like Hannibal. I don't know how I should feel about that. Okay. Only fans, or I guess you're probably talking about the TV show, not Hannibal Lecter, not like, what's his name? Anthony Hopkins. Okay. Does giving my kid melatonin have any adverse effects on their brain's development? That's an interesting topic. So big, okay. Melatonin, so for everybody that's unfamiliar, is essentially a hormone, neurotransmitter, whatever, that's produced within the pineal body or the pineal gland, everybody's favorite part of the brain. Whoa, what just happened? This is so weird. Okay. Producing the pineal gland, and it helps to orchestrate your circadian rhythm, meaning when you get sort of tired over the course of the day and when you sort of wake up. And generally speaking, that's tied to how much light, specifically blue light, to which you're exposed over the course of the day. Generally speaking, there's more blue light early on in the day, and then it declines as it gets later and later. There's more sort of red light and stuff like that. And blue light literally causes, when you see it, causes signals to be received in the pineal gland, and that alters circadian rhythm function. Anyway, so melatonin has been known about for a long time. It actually has a similar chemical structure to serotonin. But anyways, it has been evaluated as a potential sleep aid mostly. And the best evidence that I've seen indicates that it's not like a sedative. It doesn't have any sedative effects. I've tried it. It definitely wasn't sedating for me. But it has been shown to be potentially effective in retraining your circadian rhythm, like particularly if you are jet lagged or something like that. It was literally evaluated, I think, by the U.S. Air Force, because obviously they go across like a ton of different time zones and stuff like that. And so it doesn't really have any sedative effects. It's also been evaluated for any potential toxic effects. And generally speaking, it seems to be pretty well tolerated. Like that, there aren't really I guess I've never seen, studies that like evaluate, like a typical dose of melatonin is like 2 milligrams or so, a little bit less, a little bit more, 5 milligrams at the higher end, but you can get it in 10 milligrams. I've never seen like a study that evaluates like 20 grams of melatonin. I would imagine something negative might happen then. So broadly speaking, it's recognized as being pretty well tolerated. However, when it comes to children's brains, that's sort of a different calculus. And I would feel uncomfortable saying that it is completely without any risks relative to most, psychoactive substances that a young developing brain could be exposed, to which, a brain like that could be exposed. It's probably along the more benign end of the spectrum, but frankly, I would want to check to see if there's actually any studies that evaluate any developmental effects. So I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. But I can't tell you for sure that it's totally benign. I'm sorry to say. I think melatonin is the best for your insomnia. Well, the thing with insomnia is that actually melatonin is not that effective for the treatment of insomnia. Insomnia arises, for anybody that's not familiar with that term, I doubt that anybody isn't, but insomnia is the inability to sleep. And generally speaking, like bouts of insomnia occur where people find it, can't sleep for several days. Generally speaking, eventually they fall asleep. Or what happens, which is very creepy, is if you have been severely sleep deprived, your brain will enter into what are called microsleeps, where you literally fall asleep for like, split seconds. And, your brain is like it's sort of like there's like you have a sleep debt, and you need to make up that debt. You need to pay that debt. And so your brain is like trying to just reduce the debt. And so, and that can be very dangerous, right? Particularly when you're sleeping. I bet that that's not the real Joe Biden. And so I would imagine that whomever is not the real Joe Biden is probably not interested in talking about the brain. That's what I would guess. Okay. Oh, wait, what am I doing? You guys. Okay. Hey, Joy, good to see you. Glad you're in here. Oh, and Sherry, thank you so much for the super hearts. I really appreciate it. Okay, like a plant. You mean it's all me? Who would say no to that? I mean, no needles, no poking, and no prodding. Just your own frequency. Okay, wait. Can we just put people inside a machine that uses light and sound to skip some of the debate? Some of the debate? Like political debate? I mean, the debates are over. Okay. What? Okay. Oh, you're still asking the same thing. Can you analyze... Okay. What's brain food? Well, pretty much everything you eat is brain food. In fact, your brain demands about 20 to 25% of your total caloric intake. So think about that. Brain isn't a muscle. It's not your heart. It's not, it is an organ, but it's not, like your, whatever, your kidneys that are like constantly active and stuff like that. It is constantly active though, but it's just sitting there in this wet sort of cave of your skull, and it demands disproportionate amounts of your total caloric intake, of like the total like carbohydrates that you consume. And so it has a lot of different tools to ensure that it gets a sufficient level of nutrient delivery. So in fact, I'll give you an example. So there are a bunch of different ions that are critical to neuronal function: sodium, potassium. These are the ions of the ionic form of these elements, I guess, but these atoms. So another one that's very important is calcium. Essentially, without calcium, Ca2+, it would be very difficult to release neurotransmitters. And so calcium is a very, very critical, nutrient to have at the disposal of the brain. And, generally speaking, you'll get enough calcium from your diet, from eating dairy products, cheese, or, whatever. I don't have to tell you where to get calcium, right? But it turns out that if you're getting insufficient calcium, you have this really, really useful store of calcium available to your brain, available to it, right? Your skeleton. So your brain will begin leaching calcium from your skeleton to ensure that it has a sufficient amount of calcium. Not great for your skeleton, but that's how in control the brain is of, in the regulation of all of these processes. So all this to say, everything that you eat will in some way, shape, or form, affect the nutrient landscape within your brain. Broadly speaking, if you're interested in like what's the best diet for the brain, probably if you were to talk to, a majority of biomedical scientists and physicians, what they'd recommend is something like the Mediterranean diet, or something that's called the MIND diet, which is sort of like an augmented Mediterranean diet. Basically, none of the components of these diets would be surprising to you, right? It's what your mother wished you ate more of. It's green leafy vegetables, a variable diet, seeds and nuts as snacks, minimize simple carbohydrates, minimize sugar, if not just totally eliminate it, using unsaturated fats, so using olive oil instead of butter, lean proteins, so things like fish, and let's see what else. Oh, the Mediterranean diet calls for white or red wine every now and then. The MIND diet does not. So whatever. There's probably no amount of alcohol that's justifiable. But so that's essentially the diet that and I should make the caveat that nutritional science is very, very challenging. It's almost as challenging as neuroscience, but that doesn't mean that any science is better than the other, right? But it's extraordinarily difficult to conduct good, high-quality science when it comes to nutrition, because questions like this, like what is the best diet for the brain? An ideal study would be that you follow a person from in the womb, from the diet to which they were exposed in the womb that their mother was eating, all the way to their last day. And you follow tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people over the course of 75, 80, 85, 90 plus years if we're lucky, and you can see this population ate this diet and this population ate that diet, and we saw these types of diseases and disorders tend to be more common among this group than that group. And then you could do the genetics research to tell this is their how they absorb nutrients and what kinds of biochemistry was occurring in their body as a byproduct of their unique genetics. And then you could also profile their microbiomes, and you could do all those things. So it's all of those things matter to determine what an optimal diet looks like. But you can't do that. And so what we have are these much shorter studies where it's like, we know that people in certain parts of Japan live unusually very, very long. I think they have the greatest number of people who are centenarians, or people who are over 100 years old. And they have a very, unique Japanese diet. It's, a lot of fish, a lot of rice, these types of things. And then we know that some populations tend to have a lot more heart disease and cancer and these types of things, and those diets are very different. And so you might be enticed to think that we should just all eat that Japanese diet, duh. But there are a bunch of anomalies, right? So, for example, there's the French paradox is what it's called, which is that, the French diet is sort of notoriously indulgent, right? It's one of my favorite diets, but it's a lot of cheese, a lot of fat, a lot of, bread and carbohydrates and wine, very good wine, but, and on and on, right? It's like all of the things that you would like say, if anything, those things are probably bad. But they live quite long, and they have low instances of heart disease, lower than Americans or people in the UK. And so what's the deal with that? So it's a very complicated science. All of this to say, with the information we have at our disposal tonight, the Mediterranean diet or the Mayan diet are probably the most recommended. And I should note, there's some pretty good evidence to suggest that caloric restriction, excluding this one recent study that came out that I did not love, but that caloric restriction has some beneficial effects independently of the diet, right? Independently of what they're eating. So you can look into that. Are weight loss supplements better than fasting? I mean, it's, that's a very, very big category of supplements. Generally speaking, the answer would be no. So I was just talking about caloric restriction, right? And so just so we're on the same page, that's a broad category of different schedules of eating. So basically it's like, the one that I do is called intermittent fasting, where you only eat during a certain period of time. You can sort of think of it, the way I think of it is that if you are thinking of, how humans evolved, and this is a bad way to think about science, by the way, just to be clear, but trying to anthropomorphize this thing, right? And evolutionary biology can be insightful. So if you can imagine how, Homo sapiens evolved in the savannas of Africa, there was a lot of time spent getting food. And so you spent a lot of the day either hunting or gathering food, and then you would eat you wouldn't eat 3 square meals a day is what I'm saying, right? That whole concept of how to eat is sort of a modern concept of eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner and all that kind of thing. So intermittent fasting is that you only eat from, 8 p.m. until you go to sleep or something like that. And you don't eat breakfast, you don't eat lunch. That is a rather stringent protocol. You can just do where you only eat from noon until 7 or something like that, or 8 o'clock, right? The point is you have a window, okay? And then during the rest of that 24-hour cycle, you're fasting, you're not eating. That's one way to do it. Some people will just fast for a day a week or 2 days a week. And then, of course, there are like the sort of the religious holy diets, right? Like the fasting for Ramadan. There's a bunch, right? And so that's what I'm talking about when it comes to caloric restriction. And so given that there's, I think, sufficient evidence to suggest that there are at least some benefits to caloric restriction, the magnitude of those benefits are still debatable, but rather than taking something that is like thermogenic or something like that, like some kind of supplement, I think it would take a lot for me to be convinced that any given supplement is superior to caloric restriction. Did I go to Harvard? No, I went to University of Pennsylvania. Why would I go there? Ugh. I'm kidding. That is obnoxious. That university, what do you call that? Rivalry. That's why I didn't go to Harvard. Okay. Are there individuals whose brains demand a substantial amount more than 25% of caloric function? That is a really interesting question. I don't know. My guess would be that it sort of varies. And that 20-25%, that is like an estimate. And it almost certainly varies according to what you're doing at any given moment. If you're just like sitting in bed and you're awake, you're not sleeping, but you're just sitting in bed, your brain is not that calorically demanding relative to like when you're running in a marathon or something like that. In fact, I remember there are studies that were evaluating like the patterns of brain activity in somebody who was playing chess, like a high level chess player, and like just like the magnitude of brain activity reflected that of somebody who was like very cardiovascularly active. It's kind of cool. Okay, can you tell me how you feel about fabric softening sheets can lead to brain damage? Frankly, the great Kira, I'm unfamiliar with that whole line of concern. I mean, doesn't mean it's not true. And frankly, I tend to, my instinct when it comes to any kind of substance that's used in industrial production of any kind, particularly agriculture, but any kind in general, my instinct, rather than just trusting that they would have tested it, hey, Clinic Kids, is to be skeptical, is to assume that those are going to be toxic for me. And here's why. So right now we have the USDA in the United States, and I'm sure every country has some analogous organization. It's the body of the government that is tasked with scrutinizing food production in general, more than just food production in the US, but let's just focus on that because that's relevant. And you would think that the USDA would be testing every single pesticide, fungicide, insecticide, blah, 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 that are used in the production of industrial scale agriculture, but they don't. And which is just shocking to me. And, there is a process where these entities have to like register with the EPA and blah, blah, blah. But like there's a guy named Mark Zilka at the University of North Carolina who conducted a study evaluating. It was very big. It started very big and then narrowed in on a very specific family of fungicides. And basically, he was interested in seeing whether or not these substances that are, again, used in agriculture, just the effects that they have on cultured neurons, meaning neurons that are just growing in a dish. And basically what he found was that he saw a lot of changes in genetic activity and changes in morphology, meaning like what the neurons looked like, following exposure to these substances. And those changes tended to reflect what we tend to see in some cases of autism. And then his lab took it further and he brought it into what are called preclinical models, meaning animals, and what he saw, if they were exposed, if these animals were exposed at a very, very early developmental stage, he saw the sort of hallmarks of what the animal equivalent of autism were. And so and I'm sure he's published more since then, but he came to Penn and gave a talk, and I just remember like I was sitting in the audience, and I was just like what? How did we not know this? What? How is this legal? And evidently there's something like 40,000 such compounds that are used in industrial agriculture that have not been tested for anything, for any kind of, gestational effect, any kind of anything. They've been tested for very acute effects. Like, will this kill somebody right now? And that's basically the threshold. And so from my perspective, either, if I were writing legislation, I would task either the USDA or the NIH. I would create a new entity within the NIH to conduct these tests and to use these substances to improve yield, all that kind of stuff. There's nothing wrong with that, but somebody has to evaluate them, and we have to get just more confident that this is not happening, because the use of all of these compounds has increased since like 2008, and I think that's important. I don't think that it's not their right to make profits using substances that are deleterious to health. No, I want the science way. No, I want the science way. I'm not sure what you mean. That's what I found out. I found a lot of hidden things and not to be tested properly. Yeah, I mean it wouldn't surprise me, but again I don't know. I mean I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry to say. Okay, how do I get in a woman's? Okay, easier. Get good at something, come up with a plan of like what you want to do with your life, and get really good at something. And I think honestly, beyond like having the right jokes and all that kind of stuff, you'll develop confidence, and you'll just be, not just women, people in general are attracted to other people who have a plan and are really emotionally passionate about any given thing. It doesn't even have to be like a objectively respectable thing, right? I mean, if you get really good at Dungeons and Dragons, so yeah, that's what I would recommend. Oh, I want the science way to do it. Oh, I see. Do it that way. That is the science way. Lizzo is going to bed right now because she can't wait to microdose in the morning. Get out of here. Wait, human being. Oh, Lizzo? Are you talking about the famous person? I'm so at that age. How old am I? How old do you think I am? I love that people are asking this again. But if you're microdosing, if you're sincerely microdosing, reach out to me on Twitter. I would love to talk to you. Because I did a short video on microdosing on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. But I would love to actually have a conversation with somebody who's been doing it. Wow, you guys are accurate. Yeah, I am 32. I'm almost 33. You talk so fast, you have ADHD. You know what's funny is that like So right now I work in the New Jersey legislature, and you think I talk fast. And actually, so my lab manager, when I was, in graduate school, she's from New Jersey, and she speaks so fast. And keep in mind, I grew up in Miami, where people speak Spanish at just this like fever pitch. It's so fast, like relative to when I lived in California, and most people, and so most people in Miami either, they're from Cuba, or they have, roots in Cuba or in Puerto Rico or in South America. And in California, it's, disproportionately more like Mexican, right? And it's just, it's almost a different language at how fast they quickly they speak. But you think I speak quickly, talk to somebody from New Jersey. Because she speaks so fast. Okay. You would think, is being gay a psychologist problem? Is it a problem that only psychologists have? I don't know. It's not a problem, and it's yeah. I mean, I think the answer to the question you're really asking is no. Can you answer my question, Crystal Calm? Yeah, I thought we did. We talked. No, I thought we did. Once safe levels are documented, these substances are not retested, even if combined differently. I'm not sure what you mean. You would think. Like the biblical fasting of Daniel. Yeah, that's right. I did remember reading about that, but I don't recall the composition or like how it's devised. Yeah, cities are built for pedestrians in France. I think some of the cities for sure. Did Joy ask a question? But Philadelphia is very, very much a pedestrian city. I didn't think I would like it as much. I've lived in Miami, in just outside of Los Angeles, and Houston, in Colorado, and I thought I was going to have to put up with Philly because I just never lived really on an East Coast city, and I love it. I love a pedestrian city. Okay, let's see. He's old enough that he doesn't know Lizzo. That's correct. I didn't see your sciencey question, Joy. Sorry. Okay. Does weed and alcohol have negative effects on the brain? Okay, I assume that's what you're bringing up. So, both together? Sure. Well, so, at its simplest, what you can take home is alcohol definitely has negative effects on the brain. And essentially, there's no amount of alcohol that's totally benign. Cannabis definitely has effects on the brain. But if you are comparing it to alcohol, it's far more benign. It's never been shown to be like actually neurotoxic. It doesn't kill neurons. Alcohol at sufficient doses or over a long enough period of time at sufficient doses can be neurotoxic. And but the difference is the sort of, depending on how you think of it, there is a deleterious effect. There can be a deleterious effect of chronic cannabis use, which would be, it can change the way, your brain is it's dynamic, it's constantly changing. New synapses are being created, old ones are being removed, not always, some of them. And that process of resculpting the brain, the synaptic landscape of your brain, can be affected and influenced by the chronic presence of cannabinoids, THC, and CBD, theoretically. And so, those changes are long lasting, right? For example, there have been studies that have shown that chronic cannabis use has been associated with reductions in white matter volume in certain parts of the brain. What that means is that these are the parts of the brain that are not the neuronal cell bodies, but they're the sort of connections between neuronal cell bodies. And studies have shown that that can be reduced in chronic cannabis use. But there's not evidence that is permanent, and that isn't necessarily a negative effect. I mean, it almost certainly isn't a positive effect, but it's not necessarily like you're losing neurons that are never going to come back. So that's what I would suggest. Combining them both a lot at the same time, definitely not a good idea. Mostly because of the alcohol. But then also, these are, believe it or not, I know people would argue against this, but they're both addictive substances. Cannabis is addictive, despite the fact that, just because the withdrawal from cannabis isn't very severe, or it can be very severe, but it's not as severe as, let's say, alcohol or nicotine or heroin or, and essentially, any of the other drugs that people do for fun. But it is addictive, right? The most common thing that people cite when they're going into clinical settings for the treatment of addiction is cannabis, believe it or not. It's almost certainly just more widely used than these other drugs, but than cocaine or
heroin or these types of things. So but far be it for me to tell you what to do. I am a major proponent of legalizing cannabis, recreational cannabis, and I am proud of my new professional home state, New Jersey, for having voted that through, but like resounding majority, something like 70% of people voted in favor of it, and I think the whole country should go that way. I think the DEA and the federal government should do that, and I think it will. Can I get a witness? Love kills viruses. Wash your hands, cover your mouth, 6 feet, and all that. Yeah, that's pretty good. Peer-reviewed scopes are the best. Is the peer review process anonymous on both sides? Try to. Oh, is it anonymous on both sides? That's a really interesting topic, actually. I almost wrote a white paper about that because nominally it is anonymous. Like you don't get to know who exactly what you see is like reviewer 1, reviewer 2, reviewer 3, right? And it's generally 3 reviewers. It can be more, it can be fewer. However, there's a couple ways that you can manipulate or you can influence that process. First of all, you can, let's say I'm submitting a paper, and I know that I'm submitting a paper that describes a set of experiments that I did, and I know that it contradicts the theory of another major player in my subfield of neuroscience. I can, when I submit it to a journal like Nature or Cell or Science or whatever, I can say I would recommend that you avoid this reviewer for the following reasons, that it would be motivated reviewing, and that they wouldn't be impartial, these types of things. And then it's really at the discretion of the journal to determine whether or not they care that you don't want to be reviewed by a given person. But you can't say I want to be you actually can recommend reviewers, but that doesn't mean that that they are the reviewer. You never know that. Let's say I want Michael Brujas to review my paper. I don't know that reviewer 1 is Michael Brujas. However, that said, generally speaking, in some fields of neuroscience, if you're in them for long enough, you pretty much know everybody in the field, and you pretty much know what kind of work they do, and you can even begin to know their writing style, right? People have different styles of writing, particularly in science, and so generally speaking, and so I'll give you a very concrete example. So I submitted a paper for publication. It was like the last paper I submitted before I finished my PhD, and I got a review back, and I know who reviewer 1 was. I don't want to say it, but just because I know the critiques that they made were like straight up from his lab, and then some of them are even so arrogant, strident, to say you should cite these papers. You should cite my papers. In other words, so it's not truly anonymous. There is an effort to make peer review fully anonymous, like where the journal plays no role, that it's sort of regulated by an impartial entity, and I think that would be a good idea because let's say I'm an aspiring scientist, I'm a postdoc, and I am reviewing a paper from some other lab, and it's somebody with a Nobel Prize, and they have like 5 grants or 10 grants or whatever, and they find out that I'm the one that canned their paper. That could be bad for my career, or at least just the anticipation that it would be bad for my career could have an effect, right? It has a chilling effect, literally, like we talk about when it comes to the press. So yeah, I know that was very long. I'm sorry. I think somebody was calling in. Sorry if I missed you calling in. Oh, Javier, sorry about that, man. Yeah, you know what? Actually, what is it? Oh, it's past 6. I should probably call it a day. So I have a YouTube channel. It's called youtube.com/anthropoid. I talked about psilocybin today. I talked about a clinical trial using psilocybin. Yes, that psilocybin. For the treatment of depression. And there are some very interesting findings. And if you're interested in that, I talked about that on YouTube today. youtube.com/anthropoid. I also have a podcast. The podcast is called Wired to be Weird. We talk about things like dementia, like drugs, like dreams, like deja vu, and those are just the D topics. So check it out where all fine podcasts are potted. Otherwise, I hope I'll see you. This is a new day, I know. I'm going to try and do it during the week a little bit more frequently these days. And so, it's forbidden in your country. I'm sorry to hear that. Well, you can always reach out on Twitter if that's not, I assume it's not forbidden. Otherwise, maybe I'll try next Tuesday. We shall see. Usually it's Sunday, but I'm going to try and do it during the week now. We shall see. Otherwise, I'll see you at some point, sometime next week. Have a great week. Until then, see you there. I hope so. And stay safe. Wear a mask. Stay safe. All right. See you guys. All right. Folks on YouTube, thank you so much for hanging out. I've noticed that the viewer counts are beginning to go up, which is very, very exciting. I'm glad to see that. And I think largely just because nice folks like you have liked the videos and have subscribed. And so I really appreciate it. I am going to try to begin cutting the beginning parts out. Well, just making their own videos too. So I'll try and get there, but until then, I really appreciate your support. And if you haven't subscribed, I would appreciate if you would, let's see, what's a good verb? You would stomp on that subscribe button. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. See you guys.